Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk today about the soils of the Baskett Wildlife Research and Education Center, or the Baskett area, as we like to call it. My name is John Kabrick. I'm a research forester with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station. I'm located in Columbia, Missouri. And my co-author is Mark Abney with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. He's located in Clinton, Missouri. First, I want to begin by just saying a few things about the Baskett area. It's a wonderful place for conducting research and also for doing outreach and education. And you can see from these pictures that we've had people from various agencies, Natural Resources Conservation Service, U.S. Forest Service, as well as the university, working on collaborative research projects. And we've been able to bring students out to not only provide instruction, but also hands-on research, hands-on experience with research out at the Baskett area as well. To talk a little bit about the soils, it's really helpful to understand a little bit about the bedrock, underlying bedrock geology, since bedrock is so influential on the soils. And this map shows a generalized geologic map of Missouri. It shows the different ages of rocks across the state. This red arrow here in the center of the map shows the location of the Baskett area. And you'll notice that it's in this band of kind of a darker blue Mississippian aged bedrock here that runs it's exposed from the southwest part of the state up to the northeast part of the state, with younger Pennsylvanian age rocks exposed in northern and western Missouri, and older Ordovician rocks exposed down in the Ozark Highlands. Now, one of the most prominent bedrock layers that we encounter at the Baskett area is the Burlington Limestone Formation, which is a white fossiliferous limestone that has chert nodules in it. And chert is just silicon dioxide. It's just a rock that you find. It's very resistant to weathering. That's embedded in this limestone. It tends to remain on the landscape after the limestones weather. It's a Mississippian and aged material, which is about 320 to 360 million years old. And when this weathers, it forms a very distinctive soil parent material that we have and that we encounter at the Baskett area. So this parent material is called residuum. It's derived from rock that's weathered in place. That's just the name for residuum. And at the Baskett area, our residuums from this Burlington limestone tend to be very calcareous, meaning they're rich in calcium. They have reddish color because they're pigmented by iron oxides, this iron originating from this bedrock formation. And it's a very clayey residuum with some of these chert fragments in it. High pH, rich in base cations. The calcium and magnesium are base cations, also potassium. High cation exchange capacity, so a high ability to hold and exchange nutrients. I already mentioned a high clay content. Generally, it's greater than 55%. And the coarse fragments are around 10%. Another very important parent material that we encounter out at the Baskett area is loess. Loess is silt-sized, wind-deposited sediment that originated in the former meltwater of glaciers during the glacial times, during the Pleistocene. For us, our source of loess tends to be the Missouri River Valley that was historically draining melting ice during glacial times. These deposits of loess, this silt-sized material that's blown out of the river valleys during glacial times, tends to be thickest near its source and tends to thin away from the source. And at the Baskett area, we still find loess deposits on ridge tops and on northeast facing slopes. Another very prominent parent material that we find out at the Baskett area is called Hillslope sediments. These are materials that have been transported and deposited by erosion and deposition processes over long periods of geologic time. Hillslope sediments tend to be very similar to their source materials, but there's some sort of evidence of transporting. So it might be rounded, coarse fragments. The edges get chipped off and smoothed. There might be evidence of stratification. Sometimes there's concentration of these coarse fragments, so the soils become very rocky. And there's some other kind of evidence of weathering that takes place. Usually it's leaching on hillslope sediments. Another prominent kind of hillslope kind of parent material that we encounter at the Baskett area is alluvium. This is material that's been transported and deposited by water. There's usually evidence of this transporting by looking for stratified layers either horizontally or vertically. And these textures reflect the velocity of the water at the time of deposition. So coarse textured materials like we find in this image here tend to indicate that this was a high velocity environment when this rocky or heavy material was deposited. And some of these finer textures indicate a lower velocity at the time of deposition. Alluvium is relatively unweathered. This floodwaters are usually eroding into unweathered parent material, so these materials that are deposited are relatively unweathered. And as a consequence, they have a high nutrient supply and also a high pH. This block diagram illustrates the relationship between the bedrock, the parent materials, and the kinds of soils that we'd expect to find. At the base, we find this Burlington limestone formation indicated. You can see this redder zone here is that residuum that has formed from the weathering of that bedrock. These yellow layers indicate the different loess layers that we tend to find here in this region. And in this case, we find Peorian age and Roxana age loess. These are loess that were deposited during the Wisconsin glaciation, during the mid and early Wisconsin glaciation events. And soils that formed in these deeper layers of loess are Marion and Weller. Where the loess begins to thin and we reach these backslope positions, we typically will find soils named Bardley and Rocheport. Bardley being a soil formed primarily in the residuum and some hillslope sediments, Rocheport being a soil that formed in residuum and a little bit less, a thin layer of loess. As we get into lower backslope positions, soils that become prominent are Clinkenbeard, Bonnefemme, and sometimes Gasconade. These tend to be a little shallower to the bedrock, and they tend to have more hillslope sediments or less exposed on their surfaces. And at the river beds and creek bottoms down at the Baskett area, we tend to find soils mapped Dameron and Cedar Gap that formed in that alluvium. I'll go through some of these common soils just to give you a feel for what they look like and talk a little bit about their properties. Weller is one of the most commonly mapped soils on our ridges and summits, sometimes associated with Marion forming on broader ridgetops, Weller on narrower ridgetops. It formed in 2 or more layers of loess, and if you look at this picture, you can see this is the first layer of loess here, this Peorian, on top of this Roxana loess below. These soils tend to be very deep. They're moderately well drained. These silty materials tend to have a high water holding capacity, so they're able to supply a lot of water to plants and trees. They also have a fairly high nutrient supply capacity. And historically, these supported a lot of woodland plant communities comprising oaks, hickories, asters, and goldenrods. But in today's landscape, they often have more of a forest structure, having distinct overstory, midstory, and understory, due to an ingrowth of other shade-tolerant species like sugar maple. Historically, fire would have kept the mid and understory open in these systems, but in the absence of fire and the rich soil environment, they've been able to take on more of a forest structure. I mentioned the Bardley soils that occur in these more backslope positions. These are mapped on south and west-facing slopes. They are formed in gravelly hill slope sediments, overlying this clayey residuum from the Burlington limestone. These soils are also deep and well drained, but they have a much lower water holding capacity than, say, the Weller soils because of all these coarse fragments that are in these soils, plus the clayey or textures in the subsoil. Clays hold a lot of water, but they don't supply a lot of, they hold it so tightly they don't supply a lot of water to plants. These soils typically support woodland plant communities, including oaks, hickories, goldenrod, bottlebrush, and little bluestem. And they tend to maintain this character of these species, even in the absence of disturbances, because they have this lower water holding capacity, which makes them drier, which makes succession to other mesophytic species much more slow. A similar soil to Bardley is Clinkenbeard. This is often mapped in a complex with Bardley. So they're often found in the same slope positions, south and west facing slopes. The difference between Clinkenbeard and Bardley is it's formed primarily in gravelly hill slope sediments and probably does not have any of these residual parent materials associated with the Burlington limestone. So mostly a transported material. They also have a very dark, organic, and rich surface. They tend to be moderately deep and well drained. They have a low water holding capacity, but a high nutrient supply capacity. And much like Bardley, they also support woodland plant communities. On north and east facing slopes, we're more likely to find a soil mapped Rocheport. This formed in a thin layer of loess over the clayey residuum, so it lacks those hillslope sediments. These are also very deep soils. They're moderately well drained. They have a moderate water holding capacity and nutrient supply. The moderate holding capacity is due to the fact that they have very clayey textures in the subsoil. These support more of a forest plant community, including oaks, hickories, but sugar maple. You might find black walnut, ironwood, white ash, pawpaw, and a variety of ground flora, including spring beauty, jack-in-the-pulpit, box panic grasses, a little more of a forest structure because of these east-facing slopes and moderate water holding capacity. And the soil that's associated with Rocheport is Bonnefemme. These are also mapped in the same places and often form a complex with the Rocheport soils. They're also formed in loess and clay residuum, but they tend to be a little shallower than the Rocheport soils. They're considered moderately deep, they're well drained, they have a low water holding capacity, but a high nutrient supply. And these soils support mostly forest plant communities, including oaks, sugar maple, spicebush, and Christmas fir. In the bottomlands, we're going to usually find soils mapped as dameron. These are formed in silty alluvium, overlying gravelly alluvium. They tend to be very deep and well drained, but they're subject to flooding. They have a moderate water holding capacity and a high nutrient supply capacity. The moderate water holding capacity is due to all these coarse fragments and gravel, especially in their subsoil. These tend to support a diverse species mix, including eastern black walnut, American elm, bitternut hickory, hackberry, sycamore, Ohio buckeye, spicebush, and ground flora species like river oats and Virginia wild rye. If you want to have a better idea of how these soils are distributed across the Baskett area, you can use some of these web resources to help you see how these soils are mapped. Two of them are here are identified on my slide, the first being Web Soil Survey, and the second one being Soil Web. Both of these allow you to see where the soils are mapped, and you can click on these map units to get information about the soils that are found there. And that's all that I have to share about the soils of the Baskett area. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions about it, feel free to contact me at the information shown here. I can be reached at john.kabrick@usda.gov. I am located here in Columbia, so I'm easy to locate here on campus at the University of Missouri. Thank you very much.